It had been 5 years since my divorce. Now, at 44, I'd grown accustomed to the quiet of sleeping alone until that Tuesday night. One I'll never forget. I lay in bed, exhaustion clinging to me like a heavy blanket. The silence of the house was as comforting as it was predictable, but tonight, that familiar peace wouldn't last. A soft, hesitant knock broke through the stillness. My eyes fluttered open, heart quickening as I sat up in the darkness. Something felt off. "Evan?" I called out, my voice hushed but alert. "Yes, Mom," came the reply. My son's voice, barely more than a whisper. The door creaked open and there he was. Evan stood in the dim light wearing his flannel pajamas, but those weren't a boy's pajamas anymore. They fit the frame of a 22-year-old man. His tall silhouette filled the doorway, and though his expression showed vulnerability, I couldn't ignore the maturity in his features. My protective instincts flared, but something else twisted inside me, a discomfort I couldn't name. "Can't sleep," he finally admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. I patted the empty space next to me on the bed. "Come here," I said softly. He hesitated for a second before moving forward and slipping under the blanket. The bed creaked gently beneath his weight, and now we lay side by side, a few inches apart. His warmth was immediate. I tried not to look at him, but from the corner of my eye, I couldn't help but notice what I already knew. He wasn't a child anymore. His features were sharper now, his shoulders broader. The realization embarrassed and confused me. "Mom," he murmured, turning to face me, his voice fragile. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel so alone in this house." His vulnerability left me speechless. Instead of responding, I reached out, resting my hand on his shoulder. Without warning, he shifted toward me, wrapping his arms tightly around me. The strength of his embrace surprised me. His face pressed against the curve of my neck, his breath warm and steady against my skin. I could feel the thud of his heartbeat. Reflexively, I hugged him back, though the strange flutter in my chest made it difficult to breathe. "Sometimes it's just too much," he whispered. "Here," I murmured. "I'll always be here." But inside, I wasn't at ease. My heart raced, and I couldn't understand why his warmth overwhelmed me like this. His hug was tighter than I'd expected, his presence closer than I'd anticipated. There was innocence in the gesture, of course, but it stirred something deeper, something unsettling. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. His breathing slowed, soft and even, but I couldn't sleep. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling while one question spun through my mind. What just happened? His embrace had felt far too intimate, and what frightened me most was that I couldn't simply brush it off. When morning came, the sunlight filtered gently through the blinds, casting a soft glow over Evan's face. He was still asleep, his features relaxed and peaceful, but my gaze lingered too long, and inside I felt tangled. I turned away, resting my head back on the pillow as I tried to steady my breathing. I needed time to process the emotions that had unraveled within me last night, because one thing was certain. This wasn't just another night. It had left a mark. As the sunlight continued creeping through the room, I realized that whatever confusion had taken root, it wasn't going to disappear with the dawn. I was still carrying the weight of it, and I didn't know how to let it go. Evan was still there, deeply asleep. I carefully slid out of bed, making sure not to disturb him, and quietly headed to the kitchen. I needed some time alone, time to clear my head and calm the uneasiness brewing inside me. The thoughts from the night before clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. As I began gathering ingredients for pancakes, I tried to focus on the simple rhythm of cooking, hoping the warmth of the kitchen would soothe the whirlwind within. Evan always woke up late, but today I had a feeling it wouldn't be long before he stirred. Sure enough, a few minutes later, I heard soft footsteps. I glanced toward the doorway just in time to see him peeking in, his eyes still half closed with sleep. "Morning," he mumbled, his tone low and careful. "Morning, honey," I replied, forcing a smile as I flipped the pancakes. I tried my best to act normal, to push aside the lingering tension. But as I moved around the kitchen, I felt his gaze on me. Constant, watchful, and different. His usual easygoing demeanor had been replaced with something more cautious, more aware, like he was observing every detail of my movements. I stirred the batter slowly, the warmth of the stove wrapping around me, but it wasn't enough to push away the growing unease. Evan's gaze was there, just as it had been last night, but this morning it carried a strange intensity. I noticed the way his eyes traced me, not in a casual, distracted way, but deliberately. They weren't just looking at me, they were scanning me, following the curve of my body with an attentiveness I wasn't used to. For a moment, I tried to ignore it, pretending that everything was fine, but my heart betrayed me, racing in my chest. He had picked up on my unease. I could sense it. Evan's behavior had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Normally, he was laid back, calm, and cheerful in the mornings, but today there was a quiet tension surrounding him. It was like he had drawn an invisible line but didn't know whether to cross it. His eyes, catching the soft glow of morning light, seemed hesitant, searching. It felt like he wanted to say something, but he held himself back. I plated the pancakes and handed them to him. "Enjoy," I said, my voice carrying a hint of gloom that I couldn't hide. When he took the plate, his hands lingered on it for a second longer than necessary. Our eyes met, just briefly, but that fleeting moment was enough. There was something deeper in his gaze, something that mirrored the confusion in my own. I saw my nervous reflection staring back at me, but Evan said nothing. He simply sat down at the table and began eating in silence. Throughout breakfast, he avoided looking directly into my eyes, but each time I moved, his gaze followed me, shifting downward before landing back on me with that same quiet intensity. It was as if he were hyper-aware of every small action, every step, every gesture. This wasn't something we'd experienced before, and the turmoil within me grew stronger by the second. A voice inside whispered, "You need to figure this out now," but I wasn't ready to face what this even was. The way Evan's glances lingered and the shift in his behavior had stirred something deep inside me, something I couldn't fully understand. Standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the warm smell of pancakes, the tension between us lingered, thick and unshakable. I tried to resist it, focusing on being a mother and nothing more. But as the sunlight filtered through the window, The warmth in the room mirrored the conflicting emotions coursing through me. This was supposed to be a normal morning, just another breakfast, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like something entirely different. As the day wore on, I carried that unease with me, unable to escape it. Night approached, and exhaustion pulled at my eyes. I crawled into bed, hoping sleep would come quickly, but something inside me refused to rest. I kept tossing and turning, unable to pinpoint exactly what had shifted between us. The loneliness of my room grew heavier with each passing hour. But this time, the loneliness wasn't the same. Something had changed. Evan's behavior, his closeness, the way his presence lingered even when he wasn't there. I couldn't figure out what any of it meant, but I knew this wasn't something I could ignore forever. As my eyes fluttered closed, I felt it, the weight of the emotions from the night before pulling me deeper into confusion. Whatever was happening between us, it wasn't over. Something had begun, and I wasn't sure how to make sense of it. Slowly I drifted into sleep, though it was restless. My eyes would flutter open every so often, scanning the room before closing again, only to repeat the cycle. I could feel something coming, like an unseen weight pressing down on me, though I didn't know what. Then, suddenly, a noise shattered the fragile peace of the night. My eyes flew open, blinking rapidly as they adjusted to the darkness. The room was dimly lit by faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving, slow and deliberate. My breath hitched, and something deep inside me trembled. For a brief moment, everything blurred, as if my mind couldn't keep up with my racing heart. But then the shadow came into focus, and I realized who it was. Evan. He had entered through the slightly open door, stepping quietly as though he didn't want to wake me. My eyes widened and my heart began to pound, the sound echoing in my ears. My son, standing in my room in the middle of the night, watching me, was a scene I hadn't prepared for, and I wasn't sure how to react. His eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, reflecting a kind of intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. It reminded me of the way he'd looked at me the morning before, but this time it was more pronounced. For a moment, I tried to focus on him, to steady my breathing, but confusion surged within me like a rising tide. What was I supposed to do? My thoughts grew louder and more chaotic, each one overlapping the next. Evan being here at this hour was strange enough, but the way he carried himself, the careful yet determined steps, made it feel like more than just a coincidence. There was meaning in it, though I couldn't understand exactly what. He took another step forward, and I noticed how the soft moonlight highlighted his features, casting shadows across his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were more focused and determined than I had ever seen them. Deep inside, something screamed at me, "Don't let this happen." But before I could fully register the warning, Evan leaned down and pressed his lips against mine. It all happened so fast. In an instant, the world seemed to slow, yet my mind raced faster than ever. Time felt suspended, just the sensation of his lips on mine, warm and gentle, yet completely disorienting. My body froze, unable to move as waves of tangled emotions washed over me. This wasn't something a mother ever expected or prepared for, and it made my heart race wildly. Finally, I pulled back, breathless, and placed my hands against his chest, pushing him away. Evan, no! I gasped, my voice trembling, barely louder than a whisper. My words seemed to vanish into the thick air of the room. He stepped back slightly, his eyes reflecting something like disappointment, but he didn't leave. Evan, I said again, my voice shaking as I tried to steady myself. This isn't right. Don't do this. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest as sweat beaded along my forehead. My body felt hot, overwhelmed by adrenaline and confusion. My son, my own son, had just kissed me, and the weight of that reality crushed down on me. How had we reached this point? How had something so wrong crept into our lives without me noticing? The attention he had given me lately, the focus in his eyes, everything clicked into place at once, and it terrified me. Evan stood in the dim room, tall and silent. His gaze never wavered, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't before, a depth of longing mixed with vulnerability. The intensity of it shook me to my core. For a second, my instincts told me to comfort him, to ease his pain, but I couldn't allow myself to blur that line. I had to stay strong, to be his mother. He took another step forward, closing the distance once again. Before I could react, his lips brushed against mine and his hand slid gently from my neck down to my waist, lingering before resting at my hips. I told myself to push him away, to end this, but my body didn't move. I felt trapped between instinct and emotion, unable to act. By the time the night ended, whatever had happened between us had already slipped out of my control. When I woke the next morning, the sunlight creeping through the curtains did little to ease the heaviness in my chest. Evan was gone and I was alone. I took a deep breath, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a boulder. My steps felt heavy as I got out of bed and left the house without a word, hoping the fresh air would help me clear my mind. But it didn't. The confusion only deepened with each passing second. What had I done? How had I allowed this to happen? My son wasn't a child anymore, and maybe that was the problem. Had I been fooling myself into thinking I still saw him as a boy when clearly that wasn't true? My thoughts swirled like a storm, each question louder than the last, but none offering answers. I tried to suppress the emotions, to push them down and pretend they didn't exist. But something inside me was breaking, splintering beneath the weight of it all. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the chaos that Evan had stirred within me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I ever would. I guess I never really lived until I turned 62. As I stood there in the middle of that dim attic, a wave of realization hit me. What did Arthur hold me back from all these years? I whispered to myself. What did I deny myself? These questions felt like both a rebuke and an awakening. Jason didn't say anything. He just stood by the doorway, watching me quietly. That gave me courage. He wasn't helping me with his hands, but with the support of his steady gaze, as though he knew exactly what I needed in that moment. My fingers trembled as they traced the edges of the old photo album, flipping through memories I'd long buried. "Oh, I didn't see you there," I said, smiling as I imagined sharing this story. "Let me take you back and tell you how this all unfolded." I was 62, and honestly, I didn't expect that something as simple as cleaning out the attic would lead me to rediscover a part of myself I thought was gone forever. It all started late one morning when I finally gathered the courage to tackle the attic, a project I'd been putting off for years. It was my late husband Arthur's space, filled with boxes, dust, and the kind of memories that made my chest tighten. Arthur had been gone for 10 years now, and though I missed him, I couldn't deny the loneliness that lingered. As I climbed the attic stairs, I took a deep breath, preparing myself to sort through what felt like the leftovers of my old life. The first box I opened revealed something unexpected, an old photo album from my younger days. As I flipped through the pages, one photo in particular made my breath catch. It was from a pool party in my 20s. There I was, young, carefree, and full of life. I was holding a cocktail in one hand, wearing a bright red bikini and laughing like I didn't have a single worry. The version of me staring back from that photograph was a stranger I missed. Looking at that picture stirred something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Warmth, sadness, nostalgia, excitement. It all came rushing back, and just then I heard the creak of the attic stairs. Startled, I turned to see Jason, my stepson, standing there. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. The last time was at his college graduation, and now here he was, 27 years old, broader and more grown up, but with that familiar smile that hadn't changed a bit. He held up a cup of coffee. "Surprise," he said. "Jason, when did you get here?" I asked, caught off guard but genuinely happy to see him. "Just now," he replied, stepping into the attic. "I saw your car outside and figured I'd let myself in. Looks like you could use some help." I opened my mouth to tell him no, that I had it under control, but before I could say anything, he was already moving toward me, glancing at the album in my hands. "What's this?" he asked, reaching for the photo. I froze as his eyes locked onto the image of the younger me on the pool deck. "This is you?" he asked, surprised. "Yeah," I replied with a nervous laugh. That was my wild phase. Jason's gaze lingered on the picture for what felt like an eternity before shifting back to me. His expression was hard to read, a mixture of admiration and something else I couldn't quite place. "Wow, it's strange seeing you like this," he said softly, "but kind of amazing." His words sent a strange flicker of something through me. I wasn't sure what it was, but it stirred emotions I thought had died along with Arthur. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was something deeper, something that felt both comforting and dangerous. "Well, enough of that," I said, quickly closing the album and tucking it back into the box. But as I did, I couldn't ignore the thoughts spinning in my mind. For years, I'd lived quietly, responsibly. Arthur had been a good man, but he hadn't awakened this part of me. This moment of rediscovery, triggered by something as simple as an old photo and Jason's presence, was unsettling. "I never thought of you as someone who had a wild face," Jason said with a chuckle. I smiled faintly, my heart racing. "We all have a past, Jason." He nodded thoughtfully and leaned back against the attic wall. For a brief second, I wondered if this moment had awakened something in him too, but I shook the thought away. "Let's finish this," I said, gesturing to the boxes. As he bent down to help, I took one last glance at the photo. Maybe this was the reminder I needed, not of who I had been, but of who I could be again. "We've got to start hauling these old boxes out of here," I said, trying to shake off the emotions swirling inside me. But as I reached to close the photo album, Jason gently placed his hand over mine, stopping me. "We really need to look at this," he said, half joking but half serious. "It's unbelievable seeing you like this, so young, vibrant, and different. Come on, let's keep looking." I hesitated. Not all the pictures in that album were innocent. Beyond the carefree beach snapshots, there were bolder photos. Moments that captured the wilder, freer side of my youth. But the fascination in Jason's eyes, the way he looked at me with genuine admiration, made it hard to say no. "All right," I said with a small smile. "But some of these photos might be a bit much." Jason chuckled and nodded. "I'm sure everything's great," he said as he pulled the album into his lap and sat down beside me. His breath was warm against my skin as we flipped through the pages together. The beach party photos gave way to snapshots from my college years. Nights in crowded clubs and dimly lit bars. One picture showed me in a tight, backless red dress, laughing as I danced under flashing lights. Jason lingered on that photo, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. "This is really you?" he asked, his eyes darting between the picture and me. His face lit up with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a little bashful. "It was just youth, you know. Things were different back then." Jason was silent for a moment before finally speaking. "You're incredible." He paused, then added with a chuckle, "All this time, I've only ever thought of you as my stepmother, but looking at these pictures, you were like a total party girl." His words made me blush, but they also stirred something deeper inside me. I couldn't help but think of Arthur. Even when I was young, he had never looked at me the way Jason was looking at me now. Arthur had been distant, cold, and practical, always more focused on responsibility than passion. But Jason, he was different. The way he looked at me said more than any words ever could. As we continued flipping through the album, the photos became bolder. One showed me laughing with friends, wearing short denim shorts and a bikini top. Another captured me in a plunging black dress, dancing tipsily in a nightclub. Jason smiled softly as he took in each image. "It's a privilege to see these," he said. "Even when you were younger, your beauty was breathtaking. Arthur was one lucky man." His words warmed me, but also stirred something strange, something dangerous. The more I felt Jason's attention, his admiration, the more I realized there was a pull between us, one I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just any man admiring old photos. He embodied the kind of man I had dreamed of when I was younger. Confident, openly appreciative, and curious about the sides of me I had kept hidden for years. When we reached the last page of the album, Jason gently closed it but didn't move away. His gaze stayed fixed on me. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and filled with sincerity, "you're truly extraordinary." I swallowed hard, surprised and moved by his words. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me like that, let alone said anything so genuine. As my eyes locked with his, the air between us grew heavy, and something shifted. Despite the cold, dusty atmosphere of the attic, a warmth spread inside me, as though Jason's presence was making me feel young again. I had no idea where these feelings would take me, but I couldn't deny their existence. Jason closed the album and turned toward me, the same deep admiration still reflected in his eyes. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft but unwavering, "after seeing all those pictures, I have to say this. You haven't aged a day. You still look young and absolutely beautiful." My breath hitched, and I felt a flicker of emotions that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. His words wrapped around me, stirring memories of the woman I used to be, the woman I suddenly wanted to reclaim. But as much as I longed for that sense of freedom, a voice inside me whispered a warning. I smiled faintly and took a deep breath, knowing I was standing at a precipice, unsure whether I'd pull back or fall. I closed my eyes and thought of where I could buy full body, limb clothes. The compliment took my breath away. Even in my youth, I wasn't used to hearing words like that, especially not from Arthur. My heart beat a little faster, and warmth crept into my cheeks. "Thank you, Jason," I said softly, though I couldn't help but smile as I added, "but there's no hiding the fact that I've aged." I hesitated, gathering my courage before continuing. "Maybe I've gotten older, but I haven't lost touch with my desires. I never let go of them." Jason smiled, his green eyes locked on mine, unwavering. "I can feel that," he said. "You're not just beautiful, you're absolutely captivating." I couldn't help it. My eyes wandered over him for a moment, taking in his broad, athletic frame. His tall stature, wide shoulders, and slightly tousled blonde hair gave him the effortless charm of a movie star. But it wasn't just his looks. What struck me most was the confident yet gentle expression in his eyes, a gaze that held me in place. "It's interesting, hearing something like that from someone like you," I murmured, a faint smile playing on my lips.